Luke Carver heard it before he saw it. The thin, desperate cry of a newborn cutting through the Wyoming wind like a knife. Snow burned his face, but he pushed toward the sound, knowing whatever waited in the trees wasn't meant to survive the night. Then he saw her tied to a fence post with barbed wire, beaten 3 tiny babies at her feet. "Don't let them take my daughters," she whispered. "Follow my story to the very end, and tell me in the comments the city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels." The wind roared down the ridge, shoving snow into Luke Carver's eyes as he slid from the saddle. His boots sank deep, crunching over ice-packed earth. That cry came again, not one baby, but several thin and reedy, the kind that chilled a man to the bone. He rounded the timberline and stopped cold. A woman slumped against a rotting fence post, wrists twisted behind her strands of barbed wire, biting into her flesh. Her face was pale beneath bruises, the color of old violets. Snow clung to her lashes. At her feet, 3 bundles of cloth stirred weakly. Luke's voice was steady, but low enough the wind almost stole it. "Ma'am?" Her head moved barely. "Don't let them take my daughters." He didn't waste a second. Luke yanked his knife from his boot and sliced through the wire, the steel snapping back like a snake. Blood welled instantly from the deep grooves in her skin. She didn't flinch, didn't even gasp, just sagged forward into his arms. "Easy now," he murmured, shifting her weight. She was nothing but bone and cold. One by one he gathered the infants, too silent one whimpering, and tucked them inside his coat, wrapping them in the thick wool blanket from his saddle. He pressed the smallest against his chest, feeling for the faint drumbeat of her heart. The wind screamed harder, cutting through the clearing. Luke turned toward his horse, still stamping nervously by the trees. "We've got a mile girl," he told the mare. "You hold steady for me." He swung into the saddle, hauling the woman in front of him, the babies cradled between them. Her head lolled against his shoulder. Halfway up the trail, the snow deepened, forcing him to lean forward, urging the horse step by step. "Stay with me," he said into her hair. Though he wasn't sure if he was talking to her, the babies, or the stubborn horse beneath them. The cabin appeared through the white blur like a shadow given shape. He kicked the door open, heatless air rushing out to meet them. The fire had been dead for hours. Luke lowered her onto a bed of quilts near the hearth and moved fast, stoking kindling, feeding logs, coaxing flames until the orange glow spread across the rough plank walls. Then he pulled a basket from under the workbench, lined it with rabbit pelts, and set the babies inside. The smallest whimpered again. Luke crouched low, unwrapping her enough to press 2 fingers against her cheek, cold, but not death cold. That was something. He found the goat's milk in a jug behind the woodpile, poured it into a tin bowl, and warmed it on the hearth. His hands, calloused and cracked, didn't shake until he lifted the tiny spoon to her mouth. She drank clumsily, then greedily. When he glanced back, the woman's eyes were open, dull, but focused. "Name's Luke Carver," he said quietly. She swallowed, voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Claire Dalton." Luke nodded once. "All right, Claire. You're safe now." Her gaze drifted to the basket. The smallest sneezed. Claire's lips trembled, but no tears came, not yet. Luke sat back on his heels, the firelight painting shadows across his face. Outside, the wind howled like a thing alive. Inside, 4 lives hung on the thin, stubborn thread of his promise. "You don't die here. Not on my land." Luke fed the flames until the logs caught fully the orange light pushing back the corners of cold in the cabin. Claire lay still on the quilts, her breathing shallow, but even now, lashes trembling as if her body fought to stay awake. The babies were quiet, wrapped and warm in the basket. For a moment, the only sound was the pop of resin in the fire. He pulled off his gloves, flexing his hands to bring blood back into his fingers. Then he reached for a rag and dipped it into a basin of warm water. Kneeling beside her, he started wiping away the dried blood on her ankles and calves. The bruises were deep and ugly, blooming across her skin like dark ink under pale parchment. Her knees were scraped raw. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted her gone, they'd wanted her to suffer on the way. She stirred faintly at his touch. Why are you helping me?" Her voice was cracked rough from the cold. Luke didn't look up. "Because you're still breathing. That's enough." Her lips parted like she might argue, but she let the words settle. When the water cooled, he covered her legs again and rose, going to check the babies. The smallest opened her eyes, cloudy blue, unfocused, and gave a weak little cry. Luke warmed more milk, spoon-fed her, then did the same for her sisters. By the time he finished, all three were breathing steady, the soft sound of them filling the quiet. He turned back to find Claire watching him, her eyes clearer now. "You're not from here," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No. My husband, he brought me up from Cheyenne after we married." Her words came in pieces, each one pulled up from somewhere deep. "At first, I thought I was lucky. Big house, fine dresses. But after Ella was born, he changed. After Rose, he stopped speaking to me. When June came, She trailed off, swallowing hard. "He called me cursed. Said I was nothing but a drain. That night, he and his brothers." She stopped again, her hand curling into the blanket. Luke's jaw tightened, but he didn't press. "They tied me to that post," she whispered. "Said if the snow didn't take me, it meant God wanted me to live. But they didn't think I would." He crouched down beside her, resting one weathered hand gently over hers. "Well, God or not, you made it here. That's what matters now." Her eyes dropped to his hand. She didn't pull away. By mid-afternoon, the wind had eased, leaving behind a heavy stillness. Luke stepped outside to bring in more wood, the crunch of snow under his boots the only sound. The mountains loomed pale and silent against the horizon. He stacked the logs by the hearth, knowing they'd need plenty in the nights to come. Inside, Claire was propped up on an elbow, watching the babies sleep. "They haven't cried much," she murmured. "They will," he replied, dropping the last log into place. "That's a good sign." She almost smiled, the faintest curve of her lips, before it vanished. As the day slipped toward evening, he ladled a thin rabbit stew into a tin bowl and set it beside her. "Eat slow," he told her. "Your body's had nothing for too long." She obeyed spoon by careful spoon, and halfway through she looked up at him. "You live out here alone long enough to know the quiet," he said. "That's not an answer." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "It's the one you get." She shook her head faintly but didn't push. After she'd eaten, he tended the fire again, adding another log. Outside, the sky had gone to slate gray, the cold creeping back in. The babies stirred and Claire shifted toward them. She lifted Ella, cradling her against her shoulder, breathing in the faint scent of milk and wool. Luke watched her from his chair by the fire, the way her hands, though raw and bruised, still held her child like she was made of glass. When night fell, Luke laid his rifle across his knees, listening to the silence. A storm's quiet was never true peace. It was the kind that waited, holding its breath. Claire must have felt it too, because she didn't ask why he stayed awake. She just adjusted the blankets around the babies and settled back, her eyes open in the low light. A little before dawn, a faint knock rattled the door. Luke moved without sound, setting the rifle aside, but keeping his hand near it. He opened the door just enough to see a bundled figure, Annie Rhodes' breath fogging in the frigid air. "Morning, Luke," she said quickly, stepping inside. "Annie." Her gaze flicked to Claire, then the basket of babies, before turning back to him. "It's about her," she said. "Joseph Dalton's putting it around that she's unstable, ran off with his children, hired 4 men to bring her back." Luke didn't move. "They're riding like it's a hunt," Annie added, "not a rescue." Claire's fingers tightened around Ella. Her face was pale again, but her eyes were hard. Luke gave one short nod. "Then we'll be ready." Annie pulled a small leather pouch from her coat and pressed it into his palm. "Jerky dried lentils, a flask of spirits. You'll need it." When she left the cabin, settled into a tense quiet, Luke began working without a word, reinforcing the door, setting a second crossbar, stacking wood high near the hearth. Claire watched him, saying nothing. The crackle of the fire, the only thing breaking the silence. Outside, the snow was still, but Luke knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Luke worked through the morning without pause, each task deliberate. The sound of his boots on the floor, the steady thud of nails driven into wood, the scrape of the hunting knife on a whetstone, all of it layered over the low hiss of the fire. Claire sat by the hearth, the babies sleeping beside her, watching him as if trying to read the kind of man who would fortify his home for someone he barely knew. "You've done this before," she said at last. His hammer stilled mid-swing. "Done what? Prepared for trouble." He set the hammer down and turned the latch on the newly braced door. Out here, trouble doesn't send invitations. Her eyes followed him as he crossed to the window, checking the view toward the valley. The glass was warped, catching the pale light. Joseph won't stop, she said quietly. Men like him, they'd rather destroy what they can't own than see it walk away. Luke leaned against the wall, arms folded. Then we make sure he can't touch what's yours. The words landed heavier than she expected. No one had ever called these girls hers without adding the weight of who their father was. She looked away, blinking against the heat that rose in her chest. By midday, the sky had dimmed, clouds rolling in low over the ridge. Luke stepped outside to check the snares, his breath puffing white in the still air. He moved quickly, gathering 2 rabbits, resetting the traps. Every few steps, he scanned the tree line. Inside, Claire tried to keep her hands busy, feeding the babies, mending a tear in one of the blankets. But her thoughts kept drifting to the trail that wound down into the lowlands. She pictured Joseph's men on it, wide-brimmed hats, pulled low faces, hidden their boots and spurs, marking time until they reached the cabin. Luke came back in shaking snow from his coat. "Sky's changing," he said. "We've got maybe a day before the weather turns." She met his eyes. "That means they'll ride harder." He didn't argue. He set the rabbits on the workbench and began skinning them with clean, practiced cuts. "You'll need rest tonight. If they come, you'll have to move fast." She frowned. "You're talking like I'm going to run." "You are," he said evenly. "If you stay, you give him exactly what he wants." Her jaw tightened. "And what about you?" He glanced up, meeting her gaze for a beat. "I've been standing my ground on this ridge a long time. I'm not about to start running." They ate a quiet supper, the smell of rabbit stew filling the small space. The babies were fed and wrapped tight in their basket, their soft breaths syncing with the crackle of the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing against the cabin walls like a warning. When night fell, Luke checked the rifle and the pistol he kept in the drawer by the bed. He loaded them both, set the pistol on the table within reach. Claire noticed but didn't speak. Instead, she asked, "Why do you live all the way up here?" He didn't look up from the rifle. "Same reason a deer beds down in the thicket. Safer when you can see the danger coming." She studied him, the lines in his face cut deep by weather and years. The calm way he handled the weapon, not with eagerness, but with the inevitability of someone who'd learned what it took to survive. The hours stretched long, the kind of night where even the fire seemed to burn slower. Claire dozed in the chair for a while, the babies close, but each creak of the floorboards pulled her back from the edge of sleep. Sometime after midnight, a branch cracked outside. Luke was at the window in an instant, his shadow shifting against the wall. He held there, eyes scanning the dark before easing back. "Just the wind," he murmured, but neither of them truly believed it. By morning, the air was sharp and still, the kind of stillness that made every sound stand out. Luke moved with quiet purpose, packing a small satchel, dried meat water, a wool wrap, and setting it by the back door. Claire noticed. "For me." "For you and the girls," he said. "If I tell you to go, you go. No questions." Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket draped over her lap. "You think I'd leave you here alone with them coming?" He stopped, met her eyes, and spoke without softness. "I think you've got 3 little lives that matter more than pride." The room held the weight of his words. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Late that afternoon, Luke was mending a split in the porch rail when the faint rhythm of hoofbeats reached them, slow, deliberate, still distant, but coming steady up the trail. He straightened, eyes narrowing toward the bend below. Claire stepped out onto the porch, her breath clouding the air. "Is it—" "Could be them," he said, already heading inside. He handed her the satchel. "Inside, now." She hesitated for half a heartbeat, then obeyed, moving quickly past the hearth where the babies slept. Luke followed, securing the door with both bars. The hoofbeats drew closer, crunching through the thin crust of snow. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears. She glanced toward the back, toward the satchel, but her feet stayed rooted. Luke stood by the window, watching. 4 riders, he said quietly. "And they're not here to talk." She took a step toward him, but he shook his head once his eyes locked on the approaching shadows. Luke didn't move from the window. He waited until they were just short of the porch before stepping outside, pulling the door closed behind him. Claire's breath caught when she heard the wood latch fall into place. The man in front reined his horse a few paces from the steps. His voice carried easily in the cold air. Luke Carver. Luke stood with his arms at his sides, unarmed. That's right, we're here for Claire Dalton. Joseph says she's his wife, and those babies are his by right. You've got no claim to them. She was never his, Luke said evenly, and she sure as hell ain't yours. A low laugh came from one of the riders in the back. The leader's expression didn't change. I don't care much for mountain men making decisions about what belongs to the law. That why you rode with 3 men who don't wear badges? Luke asked. The leader's jaw ticked. We don't need a badge to bring a man's property home. You call in her property, I'm calling her his wife. Luke took a slow step forward, boots crunching in the snow. She's a person, and she's under my roof now. That means she's under my protection. For a long moment, no one moved. The cold wind carried the smell of the horses, the faint jingle of tack. Claire stood inside, just behind the door, her fingers tight around the satchel strap. She couldn't see Luke's face, but she could feel the space between each word. Finally, the leader leaned back in his saddle. You think this is over? Carver? Luke didn't blink. You want to test that? Come back and try. The man's eyes narrowed. Then with a sharp tug on the reins, he turned his horse. Not worth it today, he muttered. The others followed snow spraying from their horses' hooves as they rode back down the trail. Luke watched them until they disappeared around the bend. Only then did he step back inside. Claire exhaled slowly, her shoulders sinking. They'll be back. I know, he said simply. He crossed to the fire and stoked it, the glow pushing away the chill that had seeped in. Claire moved to the cradle and lifted June, rocking her gently. He won't let this go, Joseph. He doesn't take losing well. Luke met her eyes. Neither do I. The day passed in a kind of suspended quiet. Luke spent the afternoon checking the rear window, reinforcing the shutters, moving extra food and blankets to the root cellar. Claire helped where she could, carrying wood from the stack outside, refolding the baby's blankets, keeping their little bodies warm against hers. By evening, the wind had shifted, bringing the scent of oncoming snow. Luke stood on the porch, scanning the ridge. Weather's turning again, he said over his shoulder. Claire joined him, her shawl pulled tight. The mountains were fading into the kind of haze that meant another storm would be here before dawn. If it gets bad enough, they won't ride in it, she offered. Luke shook his head. Men like that don't stop for weather. Sometimes they use it. She looked at him. What will you do if they come back? He didn't answer right away. Just kept his eyes on the horizon. Depends how they come. That night, neither of them slept much. Luke sat in the chair nearest the door, rifle propped within reach. Claire stayed near the fire, the baby swaddled and sleeping. Every gust of wind rattling the shutters made her flinch, but Luke never turned his head. He just listened. Sometime past midnight, the fire had burned low when Claire spoke quietly. You didn't have to take us in. Luke glanced at her. I couldn't leave you there. Plenty of men would have. He looked back at the fire. Then I'm not plenty of men. Morning came gray and brittle, the storm still holding off, but close. Luke stepped outside to fetch more wood and stopped at the sound of a single distant hoofbeat. Not a group this time, one rider. He tensed, watching as a figure in a green wool shawl came into view. Annie Rhodes. She dismounted quickly. Luke, she said, voice clipped. I heard in town Joseph's telling everyone you threatened his men yesterday. He's riling folks up, saying you're hiding a dangerous woman. Claire stiffened at the words. Luke's expression didn't change. Let him talk. Annie glanced at the cabin door. Talk's one thing. I also heard he sent word to a few men who don't care about law at all. If they ride up here, it won't be for a conversation. He gave a single nod. Then I'll be ready. Annie reached into her saddlebag and handed him another bundle jerky coffee extra cartridges. You'll need these more than I do. He took them with a quiet, thank you. When she left, Luke went back inside and set the supplies on the table. Claire was watching him closely now, her eyes steady. You really think you can stand them off alone? She asked. Luke met her gaze. I don't plan on being alone. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the first flakes of the coming storm began to fall. Snowflakes drifted sideways past the cabin windows, carried by a wind that had found its teeth again. Luke closed the shutters one by one, leaving only the faintest slivers of gray light in the room. Claire sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, rocking Rose in her lap, while Ella and June slept curled together in the cradle. "Storm's moving in faster than I thought," Luke said, brushing snow from his shoulders as he stepped back inside. "We'll be buried by nightfall." She glanced up. "Wouldn't that make it harder for them to find us?" "It'll make it harder for everyone to move," he said. "But a man with a grudge will push through more than most." She studied him for a moment, the lines of his face thrown into relief by the firelight. "What happens if they come in the middle of it?" Luke didn't look at her. "Then we meet him at the door." The air between them was heavy, threaded with what neither wanted to say. Claire shifted Rose to her shoulder, patting her back until the tiny girl sighed and stilled. By late afternoon, the wind had turned into a low howl, rattling the shutters hard enough to make the latch bars tremble. Luke moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, setting the rifle within easy reach, checking the pistol on the table, sliding his hunting knife into his belt. Claire's eyes followed him. "You've fought men like them before." "Not exactly like them," he admitted, "but close enough to know what they're willing to do." And his gaze met hers. "And it's never just talk when they ride this far." The babies began to fuss as the wind screamed against the walls. Claire settled them one by one, humming softly over the sound of the storm. Luke listened from across the room, his hand resting lightly on the rifle stock. Hours passed in that tense rhythm, her moving between the cradle and the fire, him checking the doors, the windows, the shadows outside. The storm had erased the trail by nightfall, snow swirling so thick that even the porch posts disappeared from sight. Just before midnight, Luke caught something beneath the wind, a muffled thud like hooves punching into deep snow. He froze, tilting his head toward the door. Another sound followed closer this time. Claire's eyes widened. "Is it—" He raised a hand for silence and moved to the window, brushing frost from the glass with the back of his knuckle. The snow's white curtain shifted just enough to reveal shapes, dark-mounted figures pushing through the storm. 3 of them. Luke turned his voice low but firm. "It's them. Take the girls. Back door, follow the creek. Stay low." She stared at him. "What about, I'll draw them off? You don't stop unless it's with law." He was already pulling the elk fur cloak from the peg and wrapping it around her shoulders, tucking a bundle of jerky and dried apples into her satchel. Claire's hand shook as he pressed a small knife into her palm. "If they catch up, don't hesitate." She swallowed hard. "Luke." "Go," he said, eyes locking on hers, just long enough for the weight of it to settle. She bundled Ella and June into the satchel carrier, took Rose into her arms, and slipped out the back door into the blizzard's roar. Luke stood still for a moment, listening until the sound of her steps vanished into the wind. Then he set to work. He dragged an old coat onto a broom handle and planted it near the southern trail, tucking a lantern behind a log so it cast moving shadows. He rode his horse halfway down the path, tied the reins to a tree, and lit a small fire just around the bend, enough smoke to draw attention, enough heat to mislead. Back at the cabin, he positioned himself by the door, rifle in hand. The pounding came minutes later, sharp, urgent fists against the wood. He opened it to find Joseph Dalton at the front, snow crusting the brim of his hat, eyes as cold as the wind at his back. "She took what's mine," Joseph said, voice slicing through the storm. "Those girls carry my name." Luke stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "You came all this way for lies, I came for blood," Joseph snapped. "She belongs to me." Luke's voice was steady. "She belongs to herself." Joseph's jaw twitched, and before Luke could move, one of the men swung the butt of his rifle hard into Luke's shoulder. Pain burst down his arm, forcing him back against the doorframe. Snow soaked into his shirt, crimson blooming at the seam. Joseph stepped forward, pistol raised, and then a voice cut through the storm. "Drop it." Lantern light swung from the tree line. Sheriff Hale emerged with 2 deputies' rifles aimed, snow-plastered to their coats. Joseph turned just in time to see Claire step from the shadows behind them, her cloak-torn face streaked with snow and resolve. "Tell them what you did," she said, voice hard. "Or I will." Joseph's mouth opened, but no words came. The sheriff didn't wait. "Arrest them," he ordered. The deputies moved fast, cuffing all 3 men and leading them away through the snow. Joseph's protests faded into the wind. Claire was already at Luke's side, dropping to her knees. Blood seeped through his shirt, but his eyes stayed on hers. "You're not dying," she said firmly. He grunted through the pain. "Wasn't planning on it." "Good," she said, pressing her hand against the wound. Because I'm not burying the only man who stood between us and hell. Despite the sting of the cold and the burn in his shoulder, Luke managed a faint smile. Knew you'd come back. The storm eased by morning, though heavy drifts clung to the ridge and muffled every sound. The trail below the cabin was wiped clean, no trace left of the struggle, except the faint line of hoofprints where the sheriff's posse had taken Joseph Dalton and his men back to town. Luke sat propped in the wooden chair by the fire, his shirt open at the shoulder where Claire had cleaned and wrapped the wound. The smell of boiled water and pine resin hung in the air. "How's the pain?" she asked, kneeling beside him to check the bandage. "More of an ache now," he said. "Guess that means I'll live." She gave him a look that was half relief, half reprimand. "You could have been killed." He shrugged slightly, wincing as the motion pulled at the stitches. "If I had to make the choice again, I would." Claire pressed her lips together, her hands lingering at his shoulder for a moment longer before she drew back. "Then I guess I'm glad I came back when I did." The babies were awake, making soft cooing sounds from their cradle. Luke glanced over, watching Ella wave her tiny fists in the air, as if challenging the world already. "They've got fight in them," he said. "They'll need it," Claire replied quietly. The next few days passed in a gentler rhythm. Luke stayed indoors, letting the wound heal, though he bristled at being idle. Claire took over most of the work, keeping the fire fed, hauling water from the barrel by the back step, preparing meals. In the evenings, she mended clothes by lamplight, while Luke sat nearby shaping bits of cedar with his pocket knife. It was on the third day after the storm that she noticed what he was carving 3 small plaques each about the length of his hand. The names were carefully etched in a clean, deliberate script, Ella Rose June. The wood was smooth oiled so that it caught the lamplight like honey. She touched the edge of one plaque with her fingertips. "No one's ever done this for them before," she murmured. "No one's ever had the sense to," Luke said. Claire smiled faintly and set the plaques on the shelf above the cradle. The babies slept beneath them that night, the fire throwing a warm glow over their little faces. By the end of the week, Luke was strong enough to help with the chores again. They began to settle into something that felt almost like a routine. Claire cooked rabbit stew thick with pine roots and wild onions. Luke hunted and split wood, the steady thud of his axe echoing in the crisp air. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Claire stepped outside with a basket of laundry. She found Luke by the workbench, sleeves rolled up, planing a piece of rough timber. "What are you making now?" she asked. "New shutter for the east window," he said without looking up. "Last storm rattled the old one so bad I'm surprised it's still hanging." Claire leaned against the post, watching the curl of wood shavings fall to the ground. "It's strange," she said softly, "how quickly a place can stop feeling like a shelter and start feeling like a home." Luke paused, lifting his eyes to hers. "That a good thing?" She nodded. "It is." The days lengthened as winter began to loosen its hold. The snow in the yard turned to patches of damp earth, and the air carried the smell of thawing pine. The babies grew stronger. Ella was first to smile, a crooked little grin that made Luke's usually steady hands falter when he saw it. But the shadow of Joseph Dalton still lingered in Claire's mind. She knew men like him didn't let go of their grudges. And Luke seemed to know it too, because even as the snow melted, he kept the rifle loaded and the door bolted at night. One evening, as Claire was folding a pile of clean blankets, she heard him at the porch steps. His boots scraped the wood, then stilled. She stepped to the doorway. "Something wrong?" He shook his head, but his eyes were fixed on the trail below. "Just keeping watch." She joined him, the cool air brushing her cheeks. The valley stretched quiet and empty beneath the fading light. "It's peaceful tonight," she said. "For now," he replied. She glanced at him, seeing the way his jaw was set. "You don't think it's over, do you?" Luke didn't answer right away. A man like Dalton, he's not used to losing, and he's sure as hell not used to being made to answer for what he's done. That's a hard thing for a man like that to swallow. Claire looked back toward the valley, the first stars beginning to pierce the blue. "Then I guess we'll be ready." They stood there for a long while, the sounds of the ridge quiet around them, the cabin's windows glowing behind. Inside, the babies slept under their new plaques, their breathing steady. The air between Luke and Claire was calm, but threaded with an unspoken truth. They had survived one storm, but the mountain had a way of testing those who stayed. The thaw crept in slowly each day, stealing a little more of winter from the ridge. Patches of green began to show through the old snow, and the sound of dripping water from the eaves marked the season's quiet shift. The cabin no longer felt like a place to hide. It had started to feel like a place to build. Claire hung freshly washed linens on a rope between two pines, while Luke worked on the roof hammering down a loose board. The rhythmic strikes echoed across the yard. Every now and then she'd glance up, catching him squinting into the sun, his hands steady despite the height. When he climbed down, she handed him a tin cup of water. "You work like the ridge owes you something," she said, smiling faintly. "Maybe it does," he replied, taking a slow drink. "It's kept me alive long enough." She tilted her head. "Or maybe you've kept yourself alive." Luke's eyes held hers for a moment, then he set the cup down and turned back to the tools. He wasn't a man who took compliments easily, she'd learned, but he didn't push them away either. Inside, the babies had grown louder in their demands. Ella rolled over on her own now. Rose was starting to push herself up on her elbows, and June had developed a cry so sharp it could cut through any conversation. Claire moved between them like it was second nature, her hands steady, even when the room was anything but. In the evenings, Luke would sit in the doorway carving. Some nights, it was small toys, other nights handles for kitchen tools, each one smoothed to a fine polish. Claire often hummed while she worked, a habit she said came from her mother. The cabin seemed to hold on to the sound even after it stopped. But peace on the ridge was never meant to be permanent. One night, just as Luke was banking the fire, a sharp knock hit the door. Not the slow, hesitant knock of a neighbor, 3 heavy raps, deliberate. Luke reached for the rifle leaning by the wall before opening it a crack. On the other side stood Sheriff Hale, his coat dusted with the red clay from down in the lowlands. "Evening, Carver," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Claire straightened from where she'd been settling the girls in their cradle. "Sheriff," she greeted cautiously. Hale removed his hat, glancing between them. "Dalton's been released. Not enough witnesses willing to stand up in court, and the ones we had, well, they changed their tune." Claire's hands tightened around the cradle's edge. Changed their tune or got paid to... The sheriff's expression didn't shift. "Doesn't matter which. He's out. And if I had to guess, he won't waste time finding his way back up here." Luke's jaw flexed. "You come to tell me to hand her over?" Hale shook his head. "I came to tell you I can't stop him if he stays inside the letter of the law. If he tries something else, then I'll act. But until then..." Claire's voice was quiet but sharp. "Until then, I'm supposed to wait for him to decide what kind of hell he wants to bring." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment before putting his hat back on. "Just keep your eyes open, both of you." When he left the door shut with a finality that made the room feel smaller, Luke leaned the rifle back against the wall, but his shoulders were tight. "He's coming," Claire said flatly. Luke met her gaze. "Then we'll be ready." The next day he walked the perimeter of the cabin, checking every weak spot. He reinforced the back latch, laid fresh kindling in the hearth so a fire could be sparked quickly, and moved extra supplies into the cellar. Claire didn't ask questions, she just worked alongside him, her eyes sharp and her movements purposeful. By evening, the air had that particular stillness she'd come to recognize, the kind that meant change was moving in. Clouds hung low, tinged with a strange, bruised color as the sun sank. Claire stood on the porch, watching the tree line. "How do you always know when trouble's close?" Luke joined her, resting one hand on the post. "Same way you know when your child's about to cry. You just feel it." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, wood smoke, but not from their chimney. Luke's eyes narrowed. "Someone's camping down near the creek. You think it's him?" He didn't answer, but his hand found the rifle again. "We'll keep the lamps low tonight." They moved inside the cabin, dim except for the low fire. Luke sat near the door, Claire by the cradle. Neither spoke much, the silence broken only by the occasional hiss of the logs. Sometime past midnight, a faint crunch of snow outside made Luke rise without a sound. He moved to the window, shifting the curtain just enough to see. A figure stood at the edge of the yard, still as a post, watching the cabin. Luke didn't call out. He let the curtain fall back into place, his mind already working through the next move. Claire's eyes followed him as he crossed the room. "Well, they're here," he said quietly. "And they're waiting." Luke didn't reach for the rifle right away. Instead, he stood still listening. The wind hissed through the pines beyond the yard, but beneath it was another sound, the faint jingle of a bridle chain, the slow exhale of a horse holding steady in the cold. Whoever stood out there wasn't alone. Claire kept her voice low. How many? Hard to tell, Luke said, eyes on the door. But one's close enough to see us if we move wrong. She glanced toward the cradle where Ella stirred in her sleep. If they mean to come, why wait? Because they want us nervous, he replied. Makes mistakes easier. The seconds stretched into minutes. Luke eased toward the fire, taking the rifle from its rest, checking the chamber by touch. We'll sit tight. If they're still here at first light, we'll know they're looking for more than a scare. Claire nodded, settling herself between the cradle and the hearth. The firelight caught the edge of the small knife she kept tucked into her skirt pocket, now the one Luke had given her the night of the storm. The night passed slow, broken by the baby's occasional whimpers and the restless shifting of wind outside. By dawn, the figure in the yard was gone, the snow holding only faint, half-filled prints. Luke stepped out into the brittle morning air, scanning the tree line. Tracks led toward the creek, then disappeared into a mess of churned snow where several horses had milled before riding off. They're testing the ground, he told Claire when he came back in, seeing how close they can get before I notice. And now they know, she said. He met her gaze. Now they know. The day was quiet, but the kind of quiet that's only a thin skin over something moving underneath. Luke kept busy hauling in more wood, checking the roofline, making sure the cellar was stocked. Claire tended the girls, but her eyes drifted to the window more than once. Near sundown, a sharp knock hit the door. Luke was there in 2 strides, rifle in one hand, the other lifting the latch. Annie Rhodes stepped inside, her cheeks red from the cold. I saw them, she said without preamble. 3 men riding slow past my place this morning. Didn't speak, didn't tip their hats, just watching. Claire straightened from the cradle. Joseph. Didn't see him, Annie said, but these weren't ranch hands. Looked more like the sort you find sitting in the back corner of a saloon waiting for trouble to walk in. Luke's jaw tightened. He's sending others in his place. Annie set a small bundle on the table, a loaf of bread, a pouch of dried beans, and 2 boxes of ammunition. I figured you'd need these more than me. Appreciate it, Luke said. She looked at both of them, her expression serious. If you need a place to go, we're not leaving. Claire cut in before Luke could speak. Annie's eyes softened, but she didn't argue. Then keep that rifle close. When she left, the last of the daylight was fading, and the wind carried with it the scent of snow again. Luke moved to the window, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. They're tightening the noose, he said quietly. Claire came to stand beside him. Then we break it before it closes. He glanced at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. You've changed since that night I found you. She didn't look away. I had to. That night Luke didn't sleep at all. He sat in the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, ears tuned to every creak and sigh of the cabin. Claire dozed in the chair across from him, the babies between them. Just before dawn, the sound came not from the front, but from the back of the cabin. A soft crunch, deliberate like a boot, testing frozen ground. Luke's hand tightened on the rifle. He motioned to Claire to stay put, then moved silently toward the rear. Through the frost on the back window, he saw a shadow slip between the trees. Then another. 3 in total. They weren't coming for conversation. He turned back to Claire, his voice barely more than a breath. They're here. Luke didn't waste time. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling the small satchel from its hook and setting it beside Claire. If I tell you to move, you don't look back. You take the girls, head for the creek, and keep low. Claire's hands went to the cradle, already wrapping each baby in their blankets. What about you? I'll make sure they don't follow, he said, loading the rifle with steady hands. The crunch of snow outside shifted slower now, careful. Whoever was out there was circling, testing for weak spots. Luke blew out the lantern nearest the back door, throwing half the cabin into shadow. They think they can come in quiet, he murmured. We'll make sure they regret it. Claire's eyes didn't leave him. If you fall, I'm not falling, he said, the words flat and certain. The first tap came at the rear shutter. Not a knock. A gloved finger dragging across the wood, slow, taunting. Luke raised the rifle and held it level sight, fixed on the dark space between the slats. Then a voice from outside, low and oily. Evening Carver. Heard you've been keeping company that don't belong to you. Claire froze, clutching the girls close. Luke didn't answer. Silence was his first weapon. Another voice joined in rougher. We're just here to collect. Make it easy and we'll be gone before your coffee's cold. Luke stepped closer to the shutter, his boots silent on the wood floor. You've got until I count to 3 to get off my land. A laugh drifted in from the dark. And if we don't, 1. The men outside shifted, boots crunching. 2. A hand appeared at the edge of the shutter, starting to pry it open. 3. The rifle roared in the confined space, the sound cracking through the cabin and out into the cold. The shutter slammed back into place, and a grunt of pain followed from outside. They're armed, someone shouted, panic replacing their earlier confidence. Luke moved fast, bolting the back door, then crossing to the front. They'll try there next, he told Claire. She had set the babies in the cradle again, freeing her hands to grab the small knife. Her knuckles were white around the handle. They won't take me alive, she said quietly. Boots pounded around the side of the cabin. A shadow crossed the front window, then another. One of them tried the latch, only to find the heavy bar in place. Break it, a voice barked. The first hard blow rattled the door dust falling from the rafters. Luke braced himself against the frame rifle, ready. Stay behind me, he told Claire. A second blow came, the wood groaning but holding. Then the sound of hooves, fast, urgent, cut through the chaos. The pounding on the door stopped. From outside, a new voice rang out, sharp and commanding. You boys best be explaining why you're trying to bust down Carver's door. Luke eased the bar from the latch and opened the door just enough to see Sheriff Hale astride his horse, his rifle aimed down at the intruders. One of the men held his hands out. Just collecting what's owed. What's owed. Hale's tone hardened. All I see is attempted forced entry on a man's property. You aiming to spend the rest of the season in the lockup? The 3 exchanged looks, the fight draining out of them as fast as the color from their faces. Mount up, Hale ordered. Ride out now. They didn't argue. Within moments they were gone, disappearing into the tree line like smoke blown off the ridge. Hale dismounted and stepped to the porch. You all right in there? Luke nodded once. We're fine. The sheriff's eyes slid to Claire, standing just behind him with the knife still in her grip. You've got more grit than most, ma'am. Claire didn't answer. She only reached for the cradle, checking the girls, her shoulders still tight. Hale put a hand on the doorframe. They'll be back, Carver. Might be tomorrow, might be next month, but they'll be back. Luke's voice was calm. Then we'll be ready. The sheriff gave a small nod before swinging back into the saddle. I'll keep an ear to the ground. You keep your powder dry. When he was gone, the cabin settled into a heavy quiet. Luke closed the door, resetting the bar. Claire looked at him, the flicker of the fire catching in her eyes. You risked your life for me again. He shook his head. For you and for them. She didn't look away. I won't forget it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and snow. Inside, the fire burned steady, but both of them knew the ridge wasn't done testing them yet. By afternoon, the ridge felt larger again, as if the trees had exhaled after a long hold. Sheriff Hale's tracks had already softened under new powder. The prints of the 3 men were wind-scuffed and disappearing. Luke reset the front bar, then stood a moment with his palm on the warm wood, listening to the quiet breathe back into the room. Claire tucked the knife into her skirt pocket and lifted Ella, kissing the downy curve of her head. They came for fear, she said. They left with it instead. Luke glanced over a corner of his mouth, turning. Good trade. He stoked the fire, then checked the back window, the shutter he'd reinforced with a second brace. They'll talk about this down in the lowlands, how a cabin on the ridge kicked them back to their horses. Claire set Ella in the cradle beside Rose and June. Let them talk. Truth has a way of outrunning lies when it's got legs like Sheriff Hale. Luke poured coffee, dark and hot. He handed her a tin cup. The steam fogged the air between them. For a while they just stood, shoulders almost touching cups, warming their hands. The babies slept, cheeks flushed with the heat from the hearth. Thank you, she said at last. He looked at her. For what? For not asking me to be smaller than I am. Luke blinked once, as if the words hit something he kept carefully quiet. Couldn't do it if I tried. The cabin's rhythm returned. Wood split water, hauled bread kneaded in Claire's sure hands. Luke took his axe to a stand of deadfall, the clean thok-thok echoing into the timber. Every few minutes he'd pause to look down the switchback, then turn back to work. Habit wasn't fear, it was a promise he kept renewing. Late in the day, Annie rode up scarf red against the pale sky. She swung down and leaned her forearms on the saddle horn. "Heard about the visit," she said. "Half the saloon says Hale caught 3 foxes sniffing around a hen house. The other half says the foxes limped home with their tails burned off." Claire smiled. "I prefer the second story." Annie reached into her bag and brought out a folded scrap of muslin blue thread crisscrossed in small, neat stitches. "Found this at the mercantile. Figured those girls deserved something that wasn't rescued from winter." The cloth was a tiny quilt no bigger than a bread loaf. Claire's voice softened. "They'll sleep warmer for it." Annie tipped her chin toward Luke. "Town split on Dalton. Some folks think a husband's rights stretch wider than a river. Others remember what a river can drown." Luke wiped his hands on his trousers. "You tell me which side the current favors." Annie's eyes flicked to the babies inside the window, then back. "The side that shows up with rope and fists looks weaker by the day." She mounted again. "I'll ride by more often. Make it look like business, which I suppose it is." After she left, Claire hung the blue quilt over the cradle rail. The stitching caught the light, tiny X's like stars. She traced one with her finger. "There's a world in small work," she said. Luke nodded. "Most of it, far as I can tell." They ate rabbit and onions that night, the broth rich and steaming. The babies woke and staggered chorus, so Claire and Luke passed bowls and blankets back and forth, a wordless dance learned fast and held tender. When the cabin finally went quiet, Luke set a small cedar block on the table and took up his knife. "What now?" Claire asked, leaning her chin on her hand. "A sign," he said. The blade whispered along the grain. Letters emerged slow, sure. H-E-A-R-T-H. He paused, drew the next line. "A man needs to name the thing that saves him." Her gaze lingered on his hands. "And what will you call it?" He kept carving. "The hearth at Carver Ridge." Claire repeated it under her breath, tasting each word. "Then it's not a place you hide. It's a place you light." Luke looked up. "That's the idea." Snow fell in small, polite flakes the next morning, the kind that dusted the pine tips and left the trail readable. A pair of traders came through near noon, hats low and coats crusted white. They saw the smoke the porch swept clean, and the man with the steady eyes. They asked for coffee, then bread, then news. Claire set mugs before them, while Luke kept a comfortable arm's length of watchfulness. The men ate, paid, and rode on with cheeks warmed and shoulders easier than when they'd arrived. By week's end, 2 ranch hands and a timber hauler had passed the same way, and each of them left with a story of a hearth that took a chill out of more than the air. Claire's stew grew thicker, Luke's woodpile higher. Between tasks, he fixed a hinge for a neighbor, mended a strap, showed a boy from a homestead 2 bends down how to set a snare without losing fingers to the cold. People began to knock on the door with something like trust instead of need. That night, Claire stood at the window watching snow curve off the porch in a clean white lip. "When I first saw this place," she said, "I thought of it as 4 walls against death. Now I see it's 4 walls around life." Luke was at the workbench oiling the sign. He lifted it, the letters dark and sure. Then, "Let's make it hold." He hung the plaque over the door with 2 iron nails, tapping each until the wood sang against the beam. Claire stepped out beside him, the air biting but gentle. The ridge looked back at them the way a great animal does when it decides you are not a threat, curious, then accepting. From below, a lone rider appeared on the switchback, the sheriff moving at an unhurried walk. He drew up, took in the sign, and grinned under his mustache. "Well, look at that," Hale said. "You gone and turned a standoff into a landmark." Luke shrugged, not quite hiding his pride. "Folks needed a place to warm their hands. Seems to me Hale said they needed a place to warm their hearts." He tipped his hat toward Claire. "Town's cooling on Dalton. Too many men saying too many wrong things in the wrong ears, and your side keeps showing up with the right kind of quiet. Funny how quiet wins when it refuses to move." Claire folded her arms lightly. "Quiet won't run. It just waits for the truth to catch up." Hale nodded. "You two keep on." He turned his horse and eased down the trail, his tracks crisp and certain. Inside, the girls were awake and loud, three voices tinkling at different notes. Claire lifted Rose while Luke gathered Ella and June, and for a few minutes the cabin was nothing but milk and laughter and the soft thud of a father's boots on pine floorboards. When the babies settled, Claire laid the new blue quilt over them and stepped back. Luke stood beside her. The fire snapped, throwing sparks like shy fireflies up the chimney. Her hand found his, no speech, no grand gesture, just the fit of fingers learning home. He looked down at their joined hands and then at the door where the sign hung firm and level. "This fire between us," he said, speaking as if measuring each word, "it never needed tending so much as shelter." Claire's smile was small, certain, and now it has one. The ridge held its breath and then let it go. Snow softened the steps. The babies dreamed. The kettle hissed. In the space they had carved from fear and winter, and men who mistook possession for love warmth settled like a living thing and stayed.